Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode, where we're going to get all into politics and talk about differences in specifically how the United States government is set up and how other parliamentary governments are set up across the world, notably Great Britain, due to historical circumstances. The topic of today's episode comes from listener Joyce Normant, and she asks, can you illustrate differences with the House of Commons versus the House of Representatives and the House of Congress comparing both the US and the UK and MPs versus senators and congressmen? And can you illustrate the differences where members will put state ahead of their party? All right, so there's a lot of government questions in there. What I'm not going to do in this episode is just go into the Encyclopedia Britannica and rattle off differences in how the parliamentary system is and how the U.S. government system is. Instead, I'm going to do as is my way, telescope out, look at some of the historical circumstances that set things up in the U.S. and UK, and talk about why that came to be. And this is an interesting question because something that came to my mind when I was listening to this question was a term that I had seen in movies before, but before I read more about government systems, I didn't understand. That term is a vote of no confidence. I'm from the United States. We do not have votes of no confidence. If you're from a government that has a parliament, then you do know what that means. Sadly, the place where I saw this in a movie that sticks out most of my memory is Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, arguably the worst of Star Wars movies, and I say that as somebody who sadly was, when in high school, camped out to see Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Anyway, that movie takes Star Wars, but if you love trade negotiations and government bickering, then that movie is for you. But at one point in the movie, Queen Amidala, played by Natalie Portman, says, "If this body is not capable of action, I suggest new leadership is needed. I move for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum's leadership." This gets into all the things in the movie with the Trade Federation invading Naboo. Anyway, I heard that term, vote of no confidence, and I didn't really know what that meant. If you're from a government that has a parliamentary system, you would know what this means, but if you're not, what it means is it is a vote and it's a statement about whether a person in power, the prime minister, whoever is sort of the head of the government, is no longer deemed fit to hold that position because they're not carrying out their obligations or inadequate in some way, or they're making decisions that others think are detrimental. So it shows the head of state that the elected parliament no longer has confidence in that person, in the appointing government. So sometimes if a vote of no confidence is passed, then an individual member might have to resign along with the entire council of ministers. What this does in a parliament is you can have parties come in and out, or you can have individual leaders go in and out, even if it's not election time. And that's not how the U.S. government works. I also remember when I was taking a political science class in college, it's been noted by many political scientists that the U.S. government is unique in that it does not have a parliamentary system, but it seems to have more safeguards against some sort of populist rule or a strongman coming to power that can completely erode checks and balances, as you might see in the example of Venezuela. That's rare. It seems that parliamentary systems have more inbuilt checks and balances to control that, such as a vote of no confidence. So what I'm going to do is go way back and look at some of the historical circumstances that led to some of these differences, and I hope this all makes sense, and I hope I don't invoke too many painful memories of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and try to make things at least a little bit more interesting than that. So that's my goal. I'm going to make things more interesting than Star Wars Episode 1. Where this comes from the American side is that in the 1770s and 1780s, there are some issues that demand the attention of the Continental Congress and later the Confederation Congress, besides the Revolutionary War. One of the biggest questions was providing some type of governance for the larger colonies' western lands. After the French and Indian War in 1763, the boundary of English settlement is basically the peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. King George issued a proclamation exactly on this, and he didn't want his subjects to settle beyond those lands because many of the Indians there had sided with the French during the war. He didn't want colonial settlement antagonizing them and leading to future warfare and a destabilization of his colonies that the French could later exploit, as they did exploit during the Revolutionary War and sided with the Americans. Well, a lot of wealthy colonists didn't like this proclamation, and it's part of what made them join the revolutionary cause. John Hancock in Massachusetts, to Ben Franklin and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry and George Mason in Virginia, many wealthy people owned land claims beyond the Appalachians. But these claims were worthless with the king's decree. So with independence, one of the very first things that the elites did was resuscitate its land titles, or at least its purported land titles. But some of these land titles overlapped. For example, as far as Virginia was concerned, what we now call the Midwest belonged to it, and colonial Virginia included today's Virginia, but also West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. So Virginia was pretty big. It was bigger than Alaska almost. Augusta County, the western county that took in that huge expanse, was the biggest county in the country. When Congress sent the Articles of Confederation to the states for their ratification in 1777, 12 ratified, but Maryland didn't, because they said they would never agree to join in a permanent confederation with Virginia so long as it had these massive western land claims. Congress tried to resolve the title disputes and the boundary issues, but Virginia congressmen like George Mason and James Madison and James Monroe responded that there was nothing in the Articles of Confederation giving Congress authority to say anything about anyone's land titles in Virginia or about the extent of Virginia's western claims. So they said that they wouldn't even discuss the matter in Congress. So the history of the Revolution shows that the revolutionaries understood their states to be sovereign, their nations to be states, and if America as a whole had been a nation and the Confederation Congress had been a national legislature, such questions should have been resolved by a majority vote. But the principle at the time was that sovereignty lay in the states. Now, I'm not going to get into all the issues of the Articles of Confederation and how they didn't really work at the time in the Constitution, but even before the Articles went into effect in 1781, many people in politics and the military wanted further strengthening of the federal center. These people took the name Federalists, and their efforts resulted in the adoption of the Federal Constitution of 1788. So why did the Federalists want to strengthen the Federation? Mostly because they thought the Revolutionary War had exposed the shortcomings of the Continental and Confederation Congress. The Continental Army and the various state military units seemed always short of men, money, and supplies. The Federalists leapt to the conclusion that if the 13 newborn states had a difficult time in obtaining credit from European monarchies and bankers to fight a war against Britain, the greatest power in the world, then it had to be because of the Articles of Confederation and they were inadequate. So the Federalists had a number of complaints about the state and federal government of the Revolutionary decade. Federalists said that only a strong government could solve the problem of a government that had barely just enough money and coercive power to do what it was intended to do, to fight wars and win, and it didn't have the resources to do much of anything else. Federalists in the Continental and Confederation Congress worked to get states to give more power to Congress. At first they were unsuccessful. Americans from New Hampshire to Georgia refused. They didn't want to trade one distant, unaccountable authority in the British Parliament for what they thought was another one in the American Congress. Rhode Island refused to ratify a tariff agreement when all 12 other states did. Virginia responded by repealing its ratification, and for Federalists, this was the last straw. An example of how confusing this was at the time is that when King George III admitted defeat, he admitted defeat to the sovereign and independent states of the United States individually. Article 1 of the Treaty of Paris put it, His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States, New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia to be free, sovereign, and independent states, that he treats with them as such, and for himself, his heirs, and successors, relinquishes all claims of the government, propriety, and territorial rights of the same and every part thereof. So King George names the 13 states as independent, and you could imagine how cumbersome it would be today with treaties to have to name all 50 states of the United States. So in order to reform the Confederation, in 1785, the states of Maryland and Virginia appointed delegates to a conference to meet at George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, on the Potomac River. The task was to negotiate an arrangement for sharing the river, establishing each state's navigation and taxing rights. The conference failed because Virginia's delegates didn't show, but a new meeting was set for the following year at Annapolis. This time the goal was a reform of the Confederation. Only 5 states sent delegates to the Annapolis Convention of 1786, so leading figures like Alexander Hamilton of New York and James Madison of Virginia called for a new convention to take place the following summer in Philadelphia. The Federalists told the state governments that the purpose of the new convention was to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Rhode Island didn't send a delegation because they didn't want to strengthen the Confederation. New York, where Governor George Clinton and a majority of the legislature were skeptical of the Federalists, sent a moderately pro-reform 3-man delegation. Nationalist Alexander Hamilton received an appointment, but his friend and political ally John Jay missed out. In Virginia, which agreed to send a delegation to help propose amendments, Richard Henry Lee, or Light Horse Harry Lee as he was known in the Revolution, and Patrick Henry, both of whom were long the dominant voices in the powerful General Assembly, stayed home. Lee confided that he didn't think the convention would do the work that he approved, and Henry said that he, quote, smelled a rat. Part of the reason is due to a history where Congress had been receptive in 1785 and 1786 when John Jay assured it that he could negotiate an agreement with Spain that would grant the states valuable trade concessions in the Caribbean. All he needed to offer in return, he said, was an American commitment to forego use of the Mississippi River, which then belonged to Spain, and they would forego this for 25 years. Under the Articles of Confederation, 9 states needed to agree to any treaty, but Congress authorized Jay to negotiate the agreement anyway, despite the objections of the 5 southern states. According to James Madison, this move by Congress converted Patrick Henry from the champion of the federal cause to a lukewarm advocate at best. If Mississippi navigation rights were actually surrendered, Madison said, Henry would become an outright opponent. The year 1787 also saw the Confederation Congress adopt its most significant legislative initiative, the Northwest Ordinance. In that law, Congress provided that states could be carved out of Virginia's former Trans-Ohio River Territory, which we now call the Midwest. Among other things, it said in Section 13 that once they had been organized, the new states would be admitted to the Union on an equal footing with the original states. The federal principle, the principle of state equality, would guide the incorporation into the United States. So, one vision of national government, the Virginia Plan, this sort of explains the differences between the American versus British loyalty to the state versus loyalty to party. James Madison had spent several months researching the history of confederations before the Philadelphia Convention. He found a lot in history to encourage his desire for a stronger federation. He decided to push for the abandonment of America's federal experiment, in fact. Madison was a veteran of many legislative battles in Virginia and in Congress, and encouraged his fellow Virginia delegates, including Governor Edmund Randolph, George Washington, and George Mason among them, to arrive in Philadelphia several days early. If the Old Dominion presented its plan at the beginning of the convention, he thought, the blueprint would guide the convention's deliberations. So when the Philadelphia Convention opened, its first acts were to install George Washington as president of the convention, to vote to close the doors so the public wouldn't know what was being discussed, and take up the constitutional proposals on which the Virginians had agreed. These provisions were called the Virginia Plan, and this was the outline of a national government. It would have substituted a central government with all the power national officials could want for the federal government of the Confederation. This was a type of government to which the people were known to be adverse, which could explain why the Philadelphia Convention operated in secret and why its minutes, like James Madison's famous notes, were kept secret for decades after the event. But there were delegates of the convention who kept notes of what was said to the point of their departure. Most notable were the notes of New York delegate Robert Yates. He was one-time Chief Justice of the Empire State. He tells us that Virginia's governor, Edmund Randolph, explained the Virginia proposal's rationale with 3 resolutions. First, resolved that a union of the state merely federal will not accomplish the objects proposed by the Articles of the Confederation, namely common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare. 2. Resolved that no treaty or treaties among any of the states as sovereign will accomplish or secure their common defense, liberty,